Okay, well, good evening, everyone. I'm Marion Pallister. I'm chair of Pax Christi Scotland, and I'd like to welcome you all on this International Day Against Nuclear Tests to an event that hopes to explore what has happened and what should now happen to the victims of nuclear tests and to the lands contaminated by test fallout. I'd also like to welcome our speakers, each an expert in his or her own way on this issue, which has been brought sharply into focus since the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons came into force in January this year. Clause 6 of the treaty seeks to compensate victims of nuclear testing and to make reparation of the lands for the lands destroyed by radiation from those tests. In many instances, those tests left indigenous peoples in many parts of the world without livelihoods and without their special places of community and worship, and sometimes harming irreparably the health of service personnel and civilians present and unprotected during such tests. With all victims in mind, and that must include the victims surely of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those tragic events that we commemorated earlier this month, I would ask Pax Christi Scotland chaplain, Father John Convery, to bring us together in reflection and prayer. Father John.
Thanks, Marion. Good evening and welcome everybody to our meeting. I thought I would begin this evening's gathering by sharing with you just a few thoughts from the visit of Pope Francis to Hiroshima in November 2019 and his reflections on the use and the experimentation of nuclear weapons. Speaking before survivors of the 1945 bombing of Hiroshima, Pope Francis called nuclear weapons and their possession immoral and suggested that countries divert the money they spend on their military to efforts to assist the poor. In a single plea to God and to all men and women of goodwill, on behalf of all the victims of nuclear weapons and experiments, and of all conflicts, let us together cry out, never again war, never again the clash of arms, never again so much suffering. The Pope told the crowds gathered at the Hiroshima Peace Memorial. On Sunday the 24th, Pope Francis visited Hiroshima and Nagasaki, two highly anticipated stops in his November visit to Japan after his stop in Thailand. Francis' visit to the site of the disaster occurred in the late hours of the afternoon. Amid an eerie silence among the nearly 30,000 gathered at the memorial, Francis embraced survivors, some of whom wept while remembering the devastating effects that the bomb had on their city and on their lives. In his speech, Francis said, "A true peace can only be an unarmed peace, and that the moral imperatives for the present and future generations are to remember, to journey together, to protect." The Pope argued the global community to eliminate the threat of nuclear weapons, even as the world today faces a climate of distrust, where the interconnectedness promised by technology is trumped by an erosion of militarism. Nagasaki's Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception, the largest Catholic cathedral in Japan, also known as Urakami for the area of the city that surrounds it, was rebuilt in 1959. It is home to the head of a statue of the Virgin Mary that miraculously survived the atomic explosion. In Nagasaki, a black marble slab commemorates the many victims of the atomic bomb, and over 500 cherry trees line the Nagasaki Nuclear Memorial Park. At the center stands a large statue of a man praying for the dead. His hand is aimed at the sky to warn against the threat of nuclear weapons. Let us pray. O God of creation and peace, we are deeply graced and profoundly grateful to live in a planet teeming with life and vitality. We share the earth with millions of other living beings that reside in your rich soils, arid deserts and towering mountains, your abundant waterways and deep oceans, your vast skies, grassy meadows and tall forests. We share not only this commonality of existence, but sadly, a commonality of grave global peril: nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons threaten to obliterate all that you have given us. Human greed, militarism, have led us all to the edge of a cliff, beyond which there is no survival. There is no winning a nuclear war. A single strike could unleash forces that can eradicate life forever. There is no nation, no people, and no way of life impervious to the reality of nuclear war. Give us the courage to stand firmly against the very existence of nuclear weapons. Let us learn, advocate, and agitate for a nuclear weapons ban and the elimination of such weapons face of this planet. We cannot gamble with your precious gifts, nor continue to live at the precipice of this nuclear abyss. Let us understand that our lives and the life of your earthly creation hang in the balance. And we ask you this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. And thank you, Father John. And holding those words in our heart, that prayer in our hearts, may I now introduce John Lax. John was a trustee and vice chair of the British Nuclear Test Veterans Association until his 80th birthday 2 weeks ago. He's a Christmas Island Operations Dominic veteran. John left the Royal Air Force in August 1975 and worked in the defence electronics industry, mainly in the field of simulation projects for various major companies. He also worked for the Sultan of Oman's Air Force on his Jaguar aircraft as an avionics systems engineer. And after qualifying as a quality assurance engineer, he graduated into what he calls lower level management roles. 10 years before planned retirement, he was made redundant. So in 1999, he formed his own company and worked for 10 years as a consultant in the automotive and aerospace industries, finally retiring in 2007. Christmas Island Operation Dominic veteran. Well, John was sent to Christmas Island as a 20-year-old senior aircraftman in the RAF in September 1961. May I hand over now to John and ask him to set us the scene and tell us the story of that posting. John Lax.
Good evening, everyone. I arrived on Christmas Island just a month after my 20th birthday. One of the sad parts about that journey was I was stuck in Hawaii for 10 days, I think it was, and I was too young to drink in Hawaii. You had to be 21. But with the careful application of a black pen, I managed to change the date on my identity card and managed to get in. That's a by the by. This first slide here, you can see there's the Hawaiian Islands, and there is Christmas Island, and that line there is the equator. So we were 115 miles north of the equator. Could I have the next one, Callum, please? Now this is Christmas Island. It looks kind of strange, but it's approximately 36 miles long and about 6.5 miles wide. And at this point here is a place jokingly called Port London. There are only two roads on Christmas Island when I was there. One was the A1 and the other was the A2. The A1 was tarmac, and that took us to work every day to the airfield, 17 miles away. This is a joking sign that was put up by our movements people. Welcome to Christmas Island. They said 119 miles north of the equator. What's 5 miles between friends? Elevation 5 feet. So yeah, highest point on our island was 5 feet. Just random views of Christmas Island. That was me sat on a fire truck. Nothing to do with fire. I was an air wireless mechanic. This was the aircraft that we had. The Americans, that's it. Their atomic weapons authority people, and there was some of the research aircraft or whatever. And that was one of our sergeants on his way home. Lucky he. Next one, please. Oh, I don't know why Wesley put this one in. A beautiful picture of me in bed. I would like to point out this picture is approximately 60 years old, so it's allowed to be a bit poor. But that was our accommodation. We were more fortunate than the earlier grapple engineers. They slept in tents. We at least had wooden huts. Next one. Again, this random views. Now, these goggles here, that they protected our eyes against the fireball. They're very black. A bit later on, I'll explain accommodation. Me and my pet kitten, which actually escaped and went to live with a soldier. Fickle thing. That's the wall of our accommodation. You'll notice that the dress is somewhat casual. This is because there was nobody to impress, so we dressed very much casual. Next one. This is the Gilbertese village. The Gilbert and Ellis Islanders who populated this village have worked on the coconut plantation, and they collected copra. Some of them actually worked with the British forces. This is before the Americans came. For example, we had a young man who maintained the power station at the airfield. Very pleasant people. They're just lovely, but they I don't know what protection they had against the blast, but I'll go into that later. Next one. they're getting some more sort of general views of the Gilbertese village. Well, that's the earlier one, the tented village. The Gilbertese were predominantly Catholic. I believe that was their church, and they had I believe the term is a peripatetic monk who went all around the islands, and he'd spend a couple of days at each island, and he'd take confession and the rest of it. When he came to us, he stayed in the officers' mess, and I think they plied him liberally with drink, because he apparently had no income, so he just he moved around from place to place, so bumming lift. Next one. He was also a very nice chap. Yeah. This is one of the bombs. This is quite late on in its development, but you can see the mushroom cloud there. Underneath, which is not showing very well, is a thing called the Wilson effect. And apparently it's only visible when a bomb is dropped over water, and it's where it sucks up the moisture. Okay, next one. Johnson Island, we thought, was where all the aircraft came from. That's a fireball there, by the way. And this was what they called the danger zone around Christmas Island. And one of the weapons that was tested, which was called Operation Frigate Bird, it landed just about here. That was a Polaris missile, the only Polaris missile with a nuclear warhead that's ever been fired. And next one. This is the list of bombs that we sat through. Operation Dominic started on the 25th of April, finished on the 11th of July. That's 78 days. And in that 78 days, we had 24 nuclear bombs and one Polaris missile. It's a Polaris missile. And that's the size of the weapons. Now, the largest one was there, I think it was that one, Bighorn, that's 7.7 megatons. All the rest were fairly small. You'll notice that they're nearly all airdrop or parachute drop, apart from that one. And this was where Bighorn was dropped, which is about 30 miles from Christmas Island. The routine for bomb tests was quite simple. The code name for the control center was Mahatma, and just outside my room was a very large loudspeaker, and Mahatma would start the countdown round about 10 o'clock the night before, and then he'd go quiet until about 3:30 in the morning, and then he'd start the countdown. Invariably, the weapons went off in the early hours of the morning when it was still dark. And what would happen, we would go out and sit on the football pitch wearing long trousers and a long sleeve shirt, these dark goggles, and for some bizarre reason, known only to the Ministry of Defence, or the Air Ministry as it was in those days, we had to wear a jungle hat. I failed to see the significance, but and we sat with our back to the detonation. Now, it's very difficult to describe the noise that a nuclear bomb makes, but if you can imagine somebody cracking a whip and then multiply that by 10,000 times, that's how loud it is. And that's from 30 miles away. the fireball is so bright that it turns the dark sky, the night sky, into daylight. In fact, it's so bright. On the first one, some comedian said, "Somebody spilt a bucket of sunshine." And for the next 15 years while I was in the Air Force, the nuclear weapon was always referred to as a bucket of sunshine. We were not allowed to look. We had these dark goggles on. And what we would do, we'd just sit there and wait. While we were sat there waiting, the mushroom cloud was starting to develop. And then you'd feel the blast, about 2 to 3 minutes, depending on how far away it was. It was just like a bolt of wind, hot wind. It would shift. It could break windows. It was quite a powerful wind. And at that point, after the blast, we could then turn around and look at the fireball, but you had to keep these dark goggles on. Now, when it first went up, I sat there and I put my hands in front of my face like that. And I could see all the bones in my hands, even through these dark goggles. I looked at the guy who sat in front of me. He was probably a meter and a half away. And I could see his spine and his ribs. That is how bright that fireball is. And then after that, when everything's dissipated, we were then given the stand down, and we then went back to our room. And because I worked at the airfield, and we started work at 6 in the morning, we just get ready in our working clothes, go and have some breakfast, climbing the bus and up to the airfield. Then the next job would be to check that there were no windows broken and the coconuts hadn't fallen off the trees and gone into because the radio section had a thatched roof. So every time there was a strong wind, coconuts would fall, some would go through the roof, then we'd have to repair the roof before we could start work. But this happened frequently. I mean, in May, for example, I think there were five bombs in 6 days, something like that, including the Polaris missile. After about 5 or 6 bombs, we got a bit blasé about these things, and instead of getting up and going sitting on the football pitch, you noticed on the barrack room there were slatted windows. We'd open the windows so they were horizontal, put the dark goggles on and roll over in bed with it, make sure you had your back to the blast. And we'd just lay in bed until it was all over. Don't think it was actually approved, but nobody actually told us we couldn't. The other thing that we wore was a radiation film badge around our neck on a chain. I've recently found out that those, having tried for many years to find out what kind of level of radiation I'd received and getting no answers, I recently found out why. These film badges are ineffective in humidity. We were at a maximum 5 feet above sea level, 115 miles or 19 miles from the equator. It was quite humid. So these film badges were about as effective as a piece of blotting paper. Once the sequence was finished in July, the Americans started to run down, move all their what they were taking away with them back to wherever it came from, and we just settled down back to our normal routine. I mean, posting to Christmas Island when I went there should have been, it was a dream posting. We knew that the grapple tests were finished. They finished in 1959. So as far as we knew, when I arrived in 61, it was just a staging post. It was a dream. 4 aircraft movements a week, 2 aircraft in, 2 aircraft out. And the rest of the time, there's swimming, sailing, fishing, scuba diving, go-kart racing, or doing nothing, depending what you want to do. And that was life on Christmas Island. I will take questions if anybody is interested. If you need a lot more information, you can talk to Becky. She probably knows more about this than I do. And failing that, contact Kerry McDade at the BNTVA. She has all the information. I no longer have access to that information.
John, thank you so much for setting the scene there. And I'm sure that people will be putting questions into the chat for later, and we'll come back. I'm sure that there'll be many questions. So thank you. Your story, I think, will have been very familiar to our next speaker, Mary Macpherson, widow of a nuclear test victim. Mary was born and raised in Fife and qualified as a physiotherapist, working in various hospitals, mostly in orthopaedics. After she married Jerry, she went to live in Argyll in the west of Scotland, and for a while was a full-time mum before returning to work in the children's hearing system. Mary says that her life then was very hectic, coping with a full-time job and her husband's ill health and 4 growing children. She was diagnosed as suffering from pernicious anemia, but treatment improved her life tremendously. Meanwhile, however, Jerry was trying to cope with one illness after another, but eventually had to take early retirement. He was in and out of hospital until he died following a stroke. Mary is now a walker, a reader, and a very active granny, and she says she's passionately opposed to nuclear weapons. So I'd like to invite her to talk about her life with Jerry and perhaps the frustrations of seeking compensation for victims, or what Clause 6 means to her. Mary, can I hand over to you, please? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Marion. So, my husband Jerry died 60 years ago, and that's him up there. Our 4 children were in their 20s then. When we were all gathered together to arrange his funeral, we realised that we already knew exactly what to do, who to phone, what paperwork needed done, and Jerry himself had already arranged what he wanted for his funeral mass. There was really nothing left to decide. Jerry had had so many illnesses in the last 12 years of his life that we had lost count of his emergency trips to hospital, usually by ambulance, once by helicopter. He had spent time in different hospitals, different intensive care units, and we had been told several times that he was not expected to survive. We had this weird feeling that we were used to Jerry dying. We weren't used to him being dead. When Jerry was called up to do his national service, he saw his birth certificate for the first time and discovered that he was adopted. It didn't make any kind of sense to him. Why would a couple adopt a baby when they already had 6 grown-up children? Well, it was because their youngest daughter, May, got pregnant when she was 19. She had been engaged to be married, but for some reason, the wedding had been called off. And Jerry's father then went on to marry someone else and now had his own family. He still lived nearby. It was a common situation back then, but it was a lot for Jerry to take in. So his mum and dad were actually his grandparents. His big sister was really his mother, and his dad wanted nothing to do with him. And that was why he had never been allowed to play with the local children, and why he was sent to boarding school at the age of 8, when his big sister, no, his mother, left home to get married. But of course, all his relatives already knew, and worse still, all the neighbours must know, he was the only one left in ignorance. It was made clear to him that he was expected to keep up the pretense. No one wanted any trouble. He felt confused and humiliated, and so glad his national service would get him away from it all for a while. Jerry enjoyed his basic training in the Air Force in England. He didn't mind the regimentation. After all, he had spent years in boarding school. When he was sent to Christmas Island, he felt a great sense of freedom. In the glorious sunshine, the troops were more relaxed. He enjoyed all the sports and competitive games that were laid on to keep him occupied. He spent much of his free time fishing, swimming, and water skiing. He made friends with some of the local men and was fascinated by their simple lifestyle. He enjoyed going fishing with them. After a few months, the problems connected with his parenthood seemed much less important. He was just glad to be alive. He started to look forward to the future and going back home. One thing he decided, though, was that he would change his name after both his grandparents died. He wanted to lose that name, which had caused so many complications in his young life, and somehow made him feel he should apologise for his own existence. He finished his national service on a high, full of confidence and hope. In his own mind, he felt that it was his experience of Christmas Island that had set him free. He didn't give radiation a thought. His health problems didn't become severe until he was in his early 50s. Jerry did not at first connect this with his time in Christmas Island. The nuclear testing was over by the time he had arrived, and he had blithely supposed then that the UK government would not unnecessarily subject its own troops or anyone else to serious danger. Jerry had been too young and naive then to realise what his posting there meant. By the time the nuclear experiments in Christmas Island became big news, he had already taken early retirement due to ill health. He was horrified to discover that the earlier veterans had been used as guinea pigs during the nuclear explosion, and many of their lives had been totally ruined during to that decision. But what upset him more was what the Christmas Islanders themselves had suffered. He saw himself now as one of the bad guys because he had actually volunteered to go. He could have opted out. He had lived many years in happy ignorance, but now he became focused on the need for a worldwide ban on the production of nuclear weapons. He joined the British Nuclear Test Veterans Association and became involved in their work. However, he always maintained that if he was awarded any compensation, he would give it to the Christmas Islanders. He felt he owed it to them. If Jerry was here now, he would be very appreciative of all the work you have done towards the success of the nuclear ban treaty. And what he would want me to say is, thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Marion, we seem to have lost your video.
Oh,
There you are.
there I am. Thank you so much. I knew Jerry for a little while and found him an intriguing and fascinating character. I'm grateful for the too short a time I had to get to know him. So thank you, Mary, for your moving account that has put human faces to the reasons for clause 6. Now I would like to introduce Dr. Becky Alexis Martin, a lecturer in cultural and political geography at Manchester Metropolitan University, who writes on the lives of nuclear test veteran families like Jerry McPherson, like John Lax. and the cultural and social significance of nuclear places and spaces. Last year, her book, Disarming Doomsday, The Human Impact of Nuclear Weapons Since Hiroshima, won the LHM Ling Outstanding First Book Prize in the British International Studies Association Awards. It's a book I would recommend to anyone who cares what weapons of mass destruction do to people and to our common home. One sentence stood out for me in relation to tonight's discussion. There is dire need for recognition, accountability, monitoring, care, compensation, and remediation across every site of nuclear testing. Becky, your book was published in 2019. The treaty came into force in January. What are your thoughts now on clause 6 and the rest of it?
Thank you so much. So it's an enormous pleasure to be here with you today, actually. So to give you, firstly, I wanted to let you all know that this is my first talk after a little period of poor health, because I myself have a severe life-limiting genetic condition. So I'm waiting for surgery on my heart, basically. But I am here, and it is such a pleasure to be here with you. I just feel very humbled by, both Mary and John's talk, by the speakers who came before me and their incredible testimonies. So I thought I'd share my screen, if that's okay with you, Marion, just to share the talk that I want to give with you. So I'm just going to make it big, hopefully. 1 minute. Okay, so to introduce myself, I am Dr. Becky Alexis Martin, and I am the author of Disarming Doomsday, and I would describe myself as an academic and an activist, as I'm also a patron for the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament Education. And my research has taken me around the world. I have seen and spoken to and interviewed the Rocky Flats Downwinder community. And this community, and they're in Colorado, and they lived near a plutonium pit manufacturing plant in the 1950s that leached contamination and radiation into the local environment, and they had to have investigations by the environmental protection agencies, and local communities weren't listened to up until the 90s. So I've worked with American communities who are processing materials for nuclear war. I've worked and spoken to the Hibakusha and listened to their testimonies and their lives. I was really lucky. I was fortunate enough to go to Christmas Island. So John will probably be sitting here and have some really interesting thoughts. I loved his talk, it was amazing, but he'll probably have some interesting thoughts about my talk too. And I'll show you some photos from there later that I think are the epitome of solidarity and peace, and kind of what we need to be working for, and within the framework for abolition for nuclear weapons, but also the abolition, the existing, thinking about making sure that nuclear weapon tests never happen again. So I've done this international research. I've been really fortunate. I've spoken to communities from around the world, from Fiji to Australia to Japan to America, and of course France, and our British nuclear test veterans. And universally, as you very kindly quoted from my book, one of the things that is universal to these communities is a sense of hope, a sense of determination, but also an experience of harm and difficulty or challenge in many different ways, shapes and forms, be that physical with their health, be that cultural and with the harm to their kind of indigenous communities, or be that social with the effects of worry and concern about genetic conditions among their families. Obviously you can imagine with my own health, I have quite a bit to draw upon as far as understanding what it must be like to live with hereditary illness is concerned, live with hereditary illness. So it's this whole plethora of different issues that I think are kind of important, and so I put them all together in this book. I've been trying to address these humanitarian and environmental consequences of the nuclear weapon tests and think about how we can move forward for quite a long time, actually, since about 2015. And the outcome of this, and I must thank, before I continue, the British Nuclear Test Veterans Association, who get all the royalties from my book, so I don't make a penny from it. It all goes back to the communities who helped me write it. But also, you know, the Lab Rats, who are a new group, and all the different communities that I've worked with, because it wouldn't be possible to produce papers like this without this amazing support and without the willingness of these communities to engage with nerdy little academics like myself. So I'm really, you know what I mean, I'm really lucky and really humbled to get to hear these amazing stories. And I had this, I had a very interesting experience actually putting together this paper. So it's, I was quite lucky because it's in a quite high impact journal. It's in Global Policy, and I worked with some amazing academics. So Matthew Bray Bolton, who's an American international relations academic, Dimity Hawkins, who's an activist at ICAN, the International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons, who helped push through the ban treaty, Sydney Tish, and also, I always worry I'm not going to pronounce her name correctly, so I'm going to lift it up. So Talai Lucia Mangione, who's a scholar, but also a Pacific Islander who's got family and relations, who've kind of lived through the nuclear weapon tests. So this paper itself kind of draws on a lot of the kind of issues and challenges that you know, go alongside internationally with all the different communities that I've worked with and all the different communities that my co-writers have worked with, right? The other lovely thing about being able to present this to you today on such a wonderful evening, such a relevant night, is that this is the first time that I'm presenting this peer-reviewed paper. So you get the first discussion, essentially, the first chat. So we examined and explored along the production process for nuclear weapons, across thinking through you know, the different places and spaces that are affected, you know, from the creation of nuclear weapons to the detonation of nuclear weapons, to try and identify and list and describe all these different kind of harms and issues under a human rights umbrella. Now, this is important because previously, a lot of the time when we've tried to kind of create or ascribe justice for these communities through policy, it's arisen under, you know, it's under litigation or it's under kind of compensation for harms rather than arguing for the person's or community's human rights. So we're kind of taking quite a new perspective from that kind of, you know, that kind of angle. So with our work, we had, you know, we had kind of had, you know, several different kind of arguments that we woven together to try and, you know, think forward and think about how we can create peace. So one of the kind of case studies that's in this paper that I wanted to tell you about is also in my book, but it's one that's really will stay with me for the rest of my life, and it was one of the most incredible experiences that I think perhaps I've had in my life, was actually traveling and working with the Christmas Islander community, the Kiribati people, and the nuclear test veterans, as the nuclear test veteran community, a small group of them, went back to commemorate the Grapple Y nuclear weapon test. And it was an absolutely astounding experience to see these veterans who'd witnessed this atomic bomb, you know, these detonations, and you know, they'd been mostly lower ranking servicemen at the time. We didn't have any officers come along with us. It was, you know, chefs, it was people who worked for the postal service, it was engineers, and they all had these amazing testimonies to share, and these you know, experiences of kind of island life, you know, with its challenges, its difficulties, from sunstroke to exposure to DDT, to coral sores, never mind the bomb, to you know, to kind of the more enjoyable aspects as well, you know, the things that kind of give them pleasure. So you know, like the camaraderie of actually living with 1,000 men on an island and playing football on the beach and that sort of thing. And catching sharks was one of the stories that I heard many times. But the reason why I wanted to tell you this about this particular community is because I think for Pax Christi, it kind of represents a wonderful story of peace. So the nuclear test veterans and I, we landed in Christmas and we were greeted by the islanders who had survived the nuclear weapon tests and who wanted to meet us and wanted to speak to us, wanted to, particularly to speak to the veterans more than me. I was educated onlooker with a camera, but he wanted to, who wanted to learn about their lives, about their families. And there was just this incredible rapport between the two communities with this shared experience, even though much of the time for the Grapple series, the servicemen were not encouraged and were not really permitted to kind of mingle with the island communities. They were, they're allowed to buy souvenirs, but they certainly didn't spend their time fraternizing with them. So it was kind of this second chance in a way, for both communities to kind of share their lives, and for such an extraordinary event, because they were commemorating, the tests. They were almost mourning some things in a way as well, but there was a lot of kind of commemoration, a lot of joy at that event. It was an amazing kind of way to see the communities come together. And with this particular photo, I wanted to show it you as well, because we've got the pastor who spoke to these two aged communities who'd somehow managed to collide, decades after, and they'd lived in the same island space. And she herself told a wonderful tale of peace. She said all about kind of the importance of thinking forward and thinking about what we can do in the future. And so this brings me back by a convoluted and hopefully by an interesting anecdote, interesting story, to think through what we need to do in the future, to think through clause 6, to think through how we are going to support these communities in the future. And the key points that we kind of came up with and considered were focused around the fact that policy intervention hasn't adequately addressed the needs or rights of survivors of UK or US nuclear tests in Kiribati or beyond, that victim assistance and environmental remediation obligations for the 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, now it's been ratified, could offer an important new opportunity for addressing the consequences of nuclear detonation. So thinking forwards about how these treaties could be used to ensure that communities receive respect for reparations and the support that they deserve. And also they offer a humanitarian and human rights framing of the effects of nuclear weapon testing. So it's this kind of alternative, as I said earlier, human rights framing, considering it through a human rights lens, moves away from government denialism, right? It moves away from this big state refusal to support communities, hopefully like the nuclear test veterans, because it's human rights. It's everybody's right to live a life, a life free of toxic contamination, to live a life free of these anxieties. So this is kind of the argument that we posit, basically, so potentially avoiding denialism by the governments and avoiding kind of litigation and liability offers this new route, really offers this new way forward to think, well, how can we support these communities in the future? How can we demand and make sure that they receive what are not litigation, not liability, not what the government is denying them, but their basic human rights? We also thought forward about how the victims of nuclear testing, what they want and what they need, what these communities want, because most of them don't just want medical assistance or don't just want money. The nuclear test veterans are an incredibly proud and amazing group of men. I say that I might be biased because I've worked with them for 6 years on and off when I was a little bit healthier, but they're astonishing, and they have great dignity, and for many of these veterans, what they want is they want recognition. They just want our government to turn around and to say, you know, yeah, you did this job. Yeah, it was a really tough job. Yeah, it looked like you were sunbathing, but actually you were working with the most formidable weapons in the world, right? And that deserves something, that deserves some sort of recognition. And, you know, so they need recognition. The indigenous communities, the communities of Australia, you know, of China, the Uyghur community, which I've also worked with in Xinjiang province, and the Russian communities, the Siberian communities, these indigenous people who lived there before the tests, they deserve that acknowledgement and that memorialization. You know, and all communities need, you know, not just medical, but psychosocial, cultural and environmental aspects to be addressed. And so future policy interventions, we hope, will acknowledge, you know, the intrinsic value of, you know, not just mention Pacific peoples here, because that's the focus of the paper, but not just Pacific peoples, but every community's place in the environment, and not just its instrumental worth. So I think that's kind of the key message here. When we think about clause 6 is, you know, we need to acknowledge intrinsic value. Some things cannot be quantified. And sometimes the best way to ensure that communities receive the reparations that they deserve is to open your heart, to listen, to pay attention to these communities, ask them what they want, and then take that forward and think about how we can kind of move forward for change and for, you know, with my work, my aspiration, of course, for a nuclear-free world. And so I've written quite a lot, and I just thought I'd pop up a little reading list, which will be available to you afterwards, because I'll ping this over if anybody wants it to be shared. So it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you. It's just a short talk today. As I said, it's my first talk since January. So, but it has been really good to be able to kind of share what I've been up to, and give you some insights and thoughts tonight. And if you've got any questions, please, you know, get them down and share them. I look forward to giving you some, you know, further thoughts later on. So thank you.
Thank you, Becky, for so much food for thought. And please, everyone, don't forget to put your questions in the chat box for Becky and for all of our speakers. Our final speaker is Jonathan Frerichs, Pax Christi International Representative at the United Nations in Geneva for Disarmament and a consultant for the World Council of Churches Commission of the Churches on International Affairs. Jonathan has worked as a reporter, writer, producer, trainer, and executive for international religious and civil society organizations, including the World Council of Churches, Lutheran World Relief, and the Middle East Council of Churches, and the World Health Organization. His professional experience is mostly in faith-based endeavors related to peace, human security, disarmament, development, and the environment, which gives him the context in which to discuss Clause 6 of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Jonathan, I hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marian. It's really a pleasure to be here with everybody and to listen to the other speakers. You can put that slide down for a second while I just ask people to prepare their thoughts. Thank you, Callum. Well, I'd like to start the talk by inviting us all to either close our eyes or just picture the pictures we've seen of test sites or of the 2 bombing sites of nuclear weapons. That landscape of lifeless devastation, that mind-numbing horror, the heartbreaking sorrow that we can call to mind with our own concern about this. And if anything in a session like this is with the benefit of the treaty, we can now see people and put them back in that place and help them to recover some of their life, or at least future generations, working on the start that's been made. And that's where the treaty really comes into play. It tells us never again, and it tells us the requirements for abolition. And I think to engage with that, our best start as people of faith is to put people into the picture and to stand with others who have that same concern. So I go to the first slide now, Callum. Here are key parts from the treaty that relate to tonight's topic. You'll see A6.1 in the middle there, the two things, A6.2. Those are the two key phrases from that article about the humanitarian consequences of environmental remediation. You see things that have come up in the talk already. P6 is preamble, paragraph 6, suffering of victims of use and of testing of nuclear weapons. P7, impact on indigenous people. P22, effective participation of women in nuclear disarmament. We've had 2 women speakers this evening, and Marion organizing this. And some place for religious leaders who get mentioned in the preamble of the treaty, thanks, I think, in large measure to Pope Francis. And then I will point out that a lot of what I have to say has to do with Article 6.1, age and gender sensitive assistance without discrimination. It's, I think, historic to have this kind of language in a treaty. And then, of course, remediation of the contaminated areas. And we'll come back at the end to Article 7, which is about international cooperation, and the fact that this treaty invites states parties to form a collective partnership around trying to implement it and address the kinds of things we're talking about at this meeting. Next slide, please. If we think of how this relates to the Pax Christi International, this treaty, and how it relates to World Council of Churches, I'm calling it a TPNW Treaty for the Prevention of Nuclear Weapons, Church Advocacy Tasks. And I think I'm going to just name 3 kinds of tasks. The first kind would be bringing words to life, spreading the news, sharing the witness. Next slide. Here are 4 short stories to bring these words to life, really, bring this article to life. This is a sideshow in Nagasaki on August 9th, 5 years ago, on the 70th anniversary of the bombing, at about 11 o'clock when that bomb was dropped. And the woman dancing and a good number of the spectators are Korean Japanese. And many of you may know that Koreans called the victims of the bombings Pipokja instead of Hibakusha, and that there were 30 or 20 or 50,000 Koreans affected by the nuclear bombing because of the large communities there. And this very talented dancer acted out what happened that morning. Next. At first, she's beautiful and graceful, and then she starts to become alarmed. And then finally, this one, she points to the sky, to the B-29, to the thing that's about to happen to her city. Next slide, please. Another short story. The lady you see here is Coco Kondo. I'll come to Psalm 139 in a minute, but just listen to her brief description of her life. She was 1 year old when the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. Her mother put her on the floor and covered her with her own body. And the house didn't kill them when it fell down. And there she is today in her mid-70s. Interestingly enough, she was never able to have children because the dose they got of radiation in her little body took care of that problem, took care of that potential, never able to have children. Her mother went on to have 2 more children because as an adult, she was less susceptible to the radiation. So Coco is just an amazing bundle of energy and incredibly alive and committed. And when you see her and you hear her story, you can't help but think of verses like Psalm 139. You formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I am wonderfully made. She is that despite the atomic bomb. And her stories go on, but let me just tell you one of them, which is a real sobering moment. There was a commission of medical experts, mostly American military doctors, and I think the Japanese were involved in some way, I'm not sure. But at one point when she was in her early teens, maybe she was 11 or 12, she was asked to come to a conference center. She was invited to put on a kind of a operation gown, you know, the thin thing you have in the hospital. And then she was walked into the back of a big room in the dark and asked to take off the operation gown, step out into onto what turned out to be a stage, and the lights came up and she was asked to take off the operation gown and stand there naked in front of 200 or 300 male doctors from America and I don't know where else. But she describes a story like that. What were they doing? They're trying to examine what happens to the victims. And to choose that as a way to do it, your mind can't take the story in. And she speaks to you as someone with a living faith. So I point again to Psalm 139. Some of you may have read the book by John Hersey called Hiroshima. Coco's father is the pastor in that book that he refers to. And he started a program to bring mutilated young females to America. He called it the Hiroshima Maidens Program, to get plastic surgery so that they could live and go ahead with their lives to some extent. So she's like Setsuko Turlo, who all of you have heard about because of the Nobel Prize, etc. Here is a Christian Japanese among the Hibakusha. Next slide, please. Look at Coco Kondo. She's surrounded by the head bishop on the upper left. That's the Protestant leader of the church in Germany. A bishop, I'm a Protestant, and so we have women bishops. The woman in black is a California bishop of the Lutheran Church. The purple man is a Norwegian bishop. And Coco has been talking to us, and she's just got us all on fire about her joie de vivre, her commitment, her energy, and what she's risen above as she talks to you about her life. Next slide, please. A third quick story. This is Darlene Keju. You can see her name at the bottom. Here she is addressing the World Council of the Churches Assembly in Vancouver, Canada in 1983. Her testimony at that assembly sharpened the World Council's commitment, shared with Pax Christi and with many in other churches, to do something about nuclear weapons. She described the jellyfish babies being born in the Marshall Islands where she grew up. She described many, many other things. She became a kind of a health pioneer for the Marshall Islands and was born in 1951, lived through 67 atmospheric tests. You might have heard the statistic that the testing in the Marshall Islands in the above ground test was like having a Hiroshima bomb every day for 11 or 13 years in terms of the kiloton, the megatonnage that was blown up. And she was able to rise above her health problems and become a crusader for women's health, for Pacific Island health, and for nuclear weapons. She died at the age of 45 of cancer, Darlene Keju. You can look up those words on YouTube and see the speech that she gave to the World Council in 1983. If you just key in those words, Darlene Keju, Vancouver, nuclear maybe. Next slide, please. I'm showing one of the famous tests in the Marshall Islands, again, where Darlene comes from. And on the bottom is a quote from the former foreign minister of the Republic of Marshall Islands. All efforts to be sane about the future must be connected to survival and peace. And the story I wanted to tell over this picture is a very short one, and you've probably heard of it. The one in bold letters there, elders of the Dean Nation in Canada go to Hiroshima to apologize in 1998. Through a Freedom of Information Act gotten by NGOs in Canada, the people of the Dean Nation, who were used as miners for the uranium that went into the American bombs that were dropped on Japan, found out what had happened to their uranium. It was their uranium that blew up those two cities. So what did they do? They went as a delegation to apologize to Hiroshima and to Nagasaki. And I think that if we want a demonstration of the dignity and the leadership of Indigenous people, There are many, many, many. This is one which stands out so strongly. Now, next slide, please. To bring this a little bit more into focus for who we are now, where we are, what we can do, the first topic is shown there in the faded back. And then the next one would be just briefly to talk about joining with other allies for the common good. And this is for me a key point, because when you work on nuclear weapons, as all of you know, I think, and let me just verify it and support that feeling from where I sit. There are so many people who are fighting for the same thing, working for the same thing, and who stand on the common ground that makes progress possible. And I just want to share an example, a powerful one, which I came into contact with partly through participation in ICANN, and then seeing her role, the work of her work's role at one of those 3 humanitarian impact conferences, which led to the decision to negotiate an actual treaty, the Vienna Conference in 2014. So I'll just give you the heart of this Mary Olson of the Natural Resources Defense Council and the research she did. Next slide. Mary went got a hold of the research of the American military doctors who kept going to the Marshall Islands to check up on what was happening to the people. And the people were sick. And they said, well, thank you. I think you guys did this stuff to us. Thank you for coming to help us. They weren't coming to help. They were coming to monitor their health over the years and to build up statistics about the impact of the bomb. And Mary got a hold of that information and disaggregated it to find out what it told us about the impact of the bomb. And so if you go to the next slide, if you're exposed in your first 5 years of life, twice as many girls as boys will have cancer. Boiling down thousands of interviews and cases into a simple fact, twice as many girls as boys for early exposure. And the next slide. 50% more women than men if you're exposed as an adult to ionizing radiation. These facts put up in this manner at that conference in Vienna were part of why we have a treaty today. Good advocacy, in this case from a scientist, a researcher, brought to the attention of the world together so that the nuclear powers can't dominate the process, where everybody's there and it shows that everybody counts. And the whole hall in that palace Congress room in Vienna was silent as Mary talked about these facts. Let's go to the next slide. It just to bring home this gender issue like nothing else. Mary says the whole idea of having reference man, which is a convention in radiation assessment, so that every human being is counted as if they were a 25 to 30-year-old adult male. The habit started in the University of Chicago with the very first nuclear reactor in the 1930s. They picked a graduate student and they made his body the standard. What Mary says is we shouldn't have a reference man, we should have a reference girl, a girl less than 5 years old. And then all of the readings about the nuclear danger would be read in a much more accurate light, much more honest light about what we're dealing with. Next slide, please. The final section, just to point out again, an example of many of the kinds of things that happen to try to, for groups like Pax Christi and World Council of Churches at the international level to make sense of this treaty. Getting help, working together to help mobilize governments and other parts of civil society for advances in the rule of law. And the way I thought of showing this in just the briefest possible way would be on the next slide. The humanitarian initiative, which led to the treaty, can be tracked through these numbers in a sense, just to show us that we're part of the majority and the majority will carry the day. So by the time the negotiations started and this Article 6 was included in the treaty, 115 countries had become members had formed regional nuclear weapon-free zones, basically the whole Southern Hemisphere, 115 countries. And churches had something to do with that, and especially with the Pacific one and the Africa one, in my experience. A few years later, by the time of the treaty coming into focus, 123 countries vote to negotiate a ban. 127, 139 endorsed the humanitarian pledge, which came out of the conferences leading up to the negotiation. 132 countries actually negotiated the treaty itself in 2017. 156 agree, don't rely on nuclear weapons. They have nothing to do with it. They don't rely on protection or have them. 159 states have agreed to a statement that it is in the basic interest of humanity that nuclear weapons are never used again under any circumstances. They voted for that statements, which include that phrase, that sentence. And then this interesting one of all is 187 of the 200 odd countries in the world don't have nuclear weapons. So I put it here because the numbers count. We're getting into the numbers with this game, with this treaty. And if you take the next slide, you see where we are. So of those potential signers and ratifiers who can be the target of your advocacy, you in Scotland talking to the government of Scotland and talking to the British government, we got 55 who are states parties. How many of the ones below this could be states parties if we keep working? We've made this much progress in just a couple years. 86 have signed. How many of the ones below could sign? I think realistically speaking, you could easily say 132 countries can sign this thing right now if they get put in front of them and we work on them along with our allies in civil society and other governments who are committed. But maybe 156 who don't rely on it, leaving just the nuclear states and the nuclear dependent states like Germany and Belgium and so on. So then to finish up, this stuff goes somewhere. And one way to show it is the next slide. This is 2013 in Geneva at the Non-Proliferation Treaty Preparatory Committee, well before most of these things happened. And this sign was put up by the NGOs in Geneva and some of the members who were at the meeting. And if you go closer to it, the next slide. Look at the list. These are humanitarian disarmament treaties. Landmines get banned, cluster munitions get banned, chemical weapons get banned, biological weapons get banned. This is 2013, 4 years before the treaty was negotiated. And we said, nukes next. And on the same kind of logic, putting people at the center of the issue and putting these inhumane weapons where they deserve to be, which is abolished, the progress has been made. There's a lot more work to do, but things do come true. And I think that that's partly responsible for the work of groups like Pax Christi and churches around the world. To leave you with a peaceful image, one more image, a young woman in Hiroshima floating the lanterns on Hiroshima Day, as happens every year, as a symbol, a witness of hope, a witness of unity, and our all shared hope for a nuclear weapon-free world. Thank you.
Gosh, thank you. I've just spotted someone's what they've put in the chat room, which says how much information is being fed to us this evening by all of the speakers. Jonathan, that was superb. I wonder if you and Becky, John and Mary could now help with the question and answer session, which Callum Timms of Pax Christi Scotland will mediate. Callum, can you take us to the questions, please? Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. And what I'll do is I'll start just by bringing our speakers on screen together and thanking you all once again for your insights tonight. They really have been fantastic, and I can only echo the sentiments that we've seen in the chat so far. If I can start then with the question that's here directed to John and Mary from Carmen. And it says, were people sent to Christmas Island informed about the nuclear essays and the possible effects? John, perhaps, could you start us off?
The answer is no. I volunteered to go to Christmas Island. The prime reason being that my father had been there in 1959. He was in the army. I wanted to see what it was like. Nobody mentioned anything about nuclear tests. In fact, the Americans didn't come out for 6 months after I got out there. And even then, we weren't told exactly what was happening. It tended to be, on the rumor trail.
Thanks, John. Mary, is that a familiar story? Was Jerry not aware of the...
Jerry seemed to be aware because he said, at the back of his mind, he felt he shouldn't go because it's just nuclear things seemed wrong to him. But when he asked other people, they said, no, it's so remote, you don't need to worry about that. It's not, you're not really taking part in it. So, and he never thought about the dangers to himself at all before he went.
Thank you both. It's striking to hear how that information wasn't shared. Becky, if I could turn to you. The comment here is that the idea of human rights and humanitarian law giving answers to this tragedy is really encouraging. Can you perhaps say a bit more about that?
Yes, no, of course. While I think, having worked on this particular paper, it's kind of key to find ways forward that give opportunities to communities, and I think when you've got so many communities who've struggled for the appropriate recognition and assistance, and nation states such as the UK and the US sort of avoided acknowledging the humanitarian and environmental costs of the test programs, in part because they see test survivors' stories as inconvenient to the deterrence narrative, right? That nuclear weapons kept the free world safe, should we say? So it's really difficult because obviously you've got these profound impacts to the lives of atomic veterans and other, nuclear survivor communities that have been really disrupted, whereby it would be really hard to argue legally that their lives have been improved and made safer by nuclear weapons. So one of the kind of important arguments around the abolition of nuclear weapons from kind of the perspective I work from very much is this kind of counter argument that is it worth violating the human rights of literally millions for the preservation of an ineffective, dirty, dangerous, outdated deterrence. So it's really difficult because you can't, when you start to explore and consider these people's lives, these communities' lives, and the impacts on their human rights, you just can't really, the position of claiming that nuclear weapons make the world safer becomes untenable. I think that's really like a really interesting it kind of builds upon Jonathan's discussion actually earlier of kind of how many communities already recognize this, how many communities have already joined in and joined nuclear-free zones through really big treaties like the Rarotonga Treaty, which created really large swathes of nuclear-free space and nuclear-free sea, which is really inconvenient to nuclear weapon possessor states. So there's this challenge because while these kind of stories have been suppressed, the treaty, the BAN treaty, the TPNW, or BAN, the Treaty for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons, it's kind of made humanitarian and environmental considerations it's put them at the forefront of global policymaking, is the way I'd describe it. So it's brought these human rights out, it's made them fresh and raw and visible again. It's made these stories, whether it's the Kiribati people cowering under blankets on tennis courts while the grapple bombs were tested, whether it's the Aboriginal community and Strait and Torres Islander communities of Maralinga being exposed to Puyu or Black Myth, radioactive rain, or whether it's the Hibakusha, the Hiroshima maidens, kind of going to have their faces reconstructed, and kind of almost trying the American trying to save face through this facial reconstruction. It's still indefensible. And so by putting human rights at the forefront, we're moving kind of the place of argument, I'd say. And I think a good way to kind of think about it actually is through the words of the Kiribati president, Tanai Mamau, because he said his country ratified because his atmosphere, ocean and land were heavily damaged and contaminated by nuclear weapons, but also because of the impacts to his people and the way that it offered this opportunity to undermine the deterrence narrative, to condemn nuclear weapons as morally, ethically and legally indefensible through this human rights framework, and positioning, creating these obligations for victim assistance and for environmental remediation and for international cooperation and assistance. You have this chance to kind of focus on the ongoing suffering caused by nuclear weapon tests through this human lens. So sorry, I really went on there. I hope that kind of gave you a bit more thought. Thank you for your question. It was a really good question.
Thank you, Becky. And then perhaps finally, if I could turn to you, Jonathan, and take a couple of questions together. You spoke throughout your presentation, or in your presentation, about what we can do now, and this idea of putting pressure on the UK government in particular, who still house nuclear weapons here in Scotland. So if I could ask you what our priority should be here in Scotland, but also if you could say a bit more about future common efforts to push for wider ratification or to build up new responses based on other instruments, Jonathan.
I hope it's not too out of place for me to say that one of the benefits of Scottish independence would be, as you all know better than I do, that you could lead the other nuclear dependent states, the Germanys and the Belgiums and the Italys, who have some really good debates going on, not least in the church, about not depending on these weapons anymore, because you obviously wouldn't want to depend on them either, and you might send them away from where they sit. But maybe that's a bit of a dream. I think more practically and more within reach would be, but still requiring really discipline and organization. Imagine, Article 7 says each state party has the right to seek and receive assistance from other state parties. It also says each state party in position to do so shall assist victims of use and tests. Now, imagine two countries or three countries that the UK regards, two countries from the Commonwealth who have signed this treaty. We can look it up and think who they could be. Imagine if they helped each other. Say South Africa started helping Malawi or something, a place where there was nuclear tests. Algeria, the French tests, for example, or Kiribati, because of the British tests. And then those two, both states parties in the treaty, would go to the British government and say, we're cleaning up your mess because we've signed this treaty. We're kind of wondering when you're going to sign it. I mean, just do the right thing and bring it to the nuclear powers respectfully and clearly and calmly, and show them that the page is being turned on this horrible chapter of human history and irresponsibility. And that kind of stuff is within reach of church advocates. The churches have people in New York and in Geneva, and some of you are in your capitals, and you can go to the foreign ministry, you can write to the foreign ministry, you can talk to your parliamentarians. It doesn't take too much to get this kind of a conversation going. And then you have a real substantive conversation. And I'll just say one more. If you sit in on the nuclear weapons meetings of the world, there's just an enormous number of elephants in the room. It's like there's no room for anybody else but the elephants. And because you have to be respectful of the big powers, but it's the emperor's new clothes. It's every fable we've ever heard about a folly. And so when the church shows up, and when civil society people show up, and researchers like Becky show up and speak from experience about and with the people who are affected, the nuclear powers by and large realize they have to pay attention and at least hear out what they aren't willing to admit that they are responsible for. And if we've done that, I think we can go home and sleep and try again tomorrow. But the treaty has the language to bring this to the fore, as all speakers have shown. It's putting the people first. And Mr. Lax, when you went, Mary, when your husband went, even the British owned servicemen weren't even first. They were forgotten. You know, nuclear weapons are so terrible, you can't be honest with anybody about what they do. And we're coming beyond that, and now it's enshrined in a treaty, which the nuclear powers are saying we'll never sign it. But they will. They will sign sometime.
Well, Jonathan, thank you. Folks, thank you very
Okay,
much. I've
sure.
enjoyed our conversation this evening. We have run over slightly, but I am really grateful to the opportunity to speak with you. And now I shall hand back to Marion.
Could I just leave you with a parting thought?
We're just going to run out of time, I'm afraid.
That's the sequence of a nuclear bomb going off.
Yeah.
Fireball, mushroom cloud development. That's what we sat through.
Yeah.
24 times, one every 3 days on average.
John, thank you for showing us that. It really brings it home at this point. I thank you, I thank Jonathan, Mary, Becky. It's been such a wonderful experience this evening to hear all of these testimonies, all of that information. And we began this evening of the International Day Against Nuclear Tests in prayer. I would like Father John Convery to, I'm afraid very quickly, to close our event in prayer. Father John, thank you.
Thank you, Marion, and thank you everybody who participated this evening. I think I speak on behalf of everybody here that we've been truly blessed with and humbled by being in the presence of some of these testimonies and that God has made that possible for us this evening. So let's just take a moment of silence to collect our thoughts and to pray inside our own hearts for all those who have suffered because of this abomination, and to pray for peace, to pray for things in a world that is much better, a world and a people more deserving than what we've heard this evening. And may Almighty God keep us, protect us, look over us and our loved ones, and grant us a quiet and a peaceful night, and give us the strength in the morning to fight for justice and to bring peace to those who even today suffer. I think especially for those in Afghanistan and in many parts of the world. May God bring peace to our hearts and peace to the world. And thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Father John. Thank you to everybody, our speakers and all who attended. And I would say to you, good night, go in peace. God bless.